Hello, and welcome to this B'nai B'rith webinar on Jewish concerns in the United States and the United Kingdom. I'm Eric Fusfield of the B'nai B'rith International Center for Human Rights and Public Policy in Washington. This is a special installment of our webinar series, as it is a joint program of B'nai B'rith International and B'nai B'rith United Kingdom. With me to help navigate the discussion is my colleague Jeremy Havardi, who directs B'nai B'rith UK's London Bureau of International Affairs. Greetings, Jeremy. 1 year into a viral pandemic, we've witnessed significant political and social changes in both the US and the UK. Here with us to discuss how these events have impacted the Jewish community's policy agenda are keen and well-respected analysts from both sides of the Atlantic. Dr. Mitchell Bard, an author and commentator, is executive director of the American-Israeli Cooperative Enterprise and director of the Jewish Virtual Library. Claudia Mendoza, a Middle East specialist, is co-chief executive of the Jewish Leadership Council, an umbrella organization of heads of British Jewish groups. Welcome to both of you. It's a pleasure to have you. Mitchell, let's start with you, if we may. It's always a moment in the Jewish world. There's always something that keeps us on our toes. We find ourselves once again trying to tease out the results of an Israeli election just concluded. But as we monitor that development still unfolding, a new administration is already settling in here in the United States. The Biden administration features a number of veterans of the Obama presidency, including, of course, President Biden himself and Secretary of State Tony Blinken. Do we have a sense yet of whether this administration represents a return to Obama-era policies in the Middle East, or have we learned things about how the Biden approach will differ?
Well, thanks for having me. I think it's still a little early to tell, although Biden really telegraphed a lot of his policies during the campaign. He made no doubt about his disagreements with the previous administration, and he wants to improve relations with the Palestinians. He's talked about resuming some aid to the Palestinians, although he faces the obstacle of the law that prohibits aid so long as they continue to fund terrorists in jails. You have a new enthusiasm for the two-state solution, although they seem to have no idea what that would look like or how you would bring it about. They don't seem to have a lot of confidence in either the Netanyahu government or the Abbas administration, but we might end up with two different administrations within the next few months. We don't know yet. The big difference already is that they've started to return to the language of Obama and other presidents of even-handedness, that they seem to be wanting to equate whatever Israel does with whatever the Palestinians might do, which is alarming because there is no equivalence between the two sides. I think that so far they've been relatively muted about issues that bother them, such as the building of settlements. But the big enchilada ultimately is going to be the question of Iran and how the administration decides to move forward. They made it very clear they want to return to the agreement with the Iranians. Fortunately for Israel and those of us who think that's a bad idea, the Iranians have no interest at the moment in resuming relations unless we basically capitulate to their demands and end all sanctions. So it's still early. The main emphasis, of course, is on the economy and on the pandemic, but diplomats don't deal with those issues. They have nothing better to do than to muck around in the Middle East, and there are lots of things already drawing their attention that they can't avoid.
Yeah, the settlements was a a constant theme in the early years of the Obama administration. There was so much attention focused on that one issue, which is one of a number of issues that remain to be negotiated between Israelis and Palestinians. But it seemed this kind of disproportionate focus on settlements seemed to dictate the tone of the relationship for a while. And it seems like there have not been any similar kinds of missteps yet that open a window into what this relationship will be like over the next 4 years.
Well, it's early, and as I call a lot of the people he put in the administration retreads who came from the Obama administration and basically made a mess of U.S. policy in the Middle East, and they don't seem to have learned their lessons if you listen to what they've said in their confirmation hearings. But as far as settlements go, we'll find out, I think, fairly early. They've asked this question in a number of State Department briefings, whether the Biden administration will uphold the Trump decision that basically said settlements are not illegal, and whether the goods from the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, will be labeled as Israel or not. And again, they haven't responded to questions from some Arab journalists who have tried to press them on that. So those issues are yet to be brought to the fore, but they can't be delayed too long. I think a lot will happen after the Israeli government is formed.
Indeed. Claudia, Great Britain sometimes finds itself dragged into tension involving the US and the Middle East. But in a post-Brexit scenario, the UK could be more of an independent actor in foreign policy. What's the British outlook toward current Middle East challenges?
Well, thank you for having me here. We are still, as a country, trying to work out what post-Brexit Britain actually looks like. Obviously, the UK-US special relationship, as it's been dubbed, has had its kind of challenges over the years, and I think Brexit really did highlight those challenges, starting with comments made by Obama about the UK going to the back of the queue. Trump was a bit warmer towards the UK, but again, there were some challenges there. I think Brexit does pose an opportunity to kind of redraw the relationship between various countries, the US and the UK being one such relationship. When we talk about foreign policy, I think we will see, I think, probably a stronger alignment between the US and the UK on Middle East issues. Now that we have Biden as president, I think, especially on the Israel-Palestine issue, on Iran, which we've yet to see the changes that are going to be implemented by the Biden administration. Certainly, we keep the pressure up on the Iran situation because we feel that Iran not only is a threat to its neighbors and to Israel, but we know that it has influence in terms of how it treats Jewish communities across the world. So we were really pleased, for example, to see Britain fully prescribe Hezbollah as a terrorist organization and dismiss with that false distinction between the political and military wings. And it's something that the EU has not done, and they still maintain that distinction. In many ways, you can see that there is a distinction between British foreign policy and EU foreign policy, and we will have more scope to create our own foreign policy now that we're no longer in the EU.
Yeah. Personalities sometimes play a role in bilateral relationships. Netanyahu governed Israel for nearly the entire Obama-Biden administration, with some tension, as we've said, resulting over Israeli settlements, and notably Netanyahu's advocacy against the Iran nuclear deal. If Netanyahu prevails, we're still waiting to see what happens. What will this portend for the US-Israeli relationship on Biden's watch? I'm curious to know, or do we place too much importance on these kinds of dynamics?
Well, personality is extremely important when it comes to U.S. relations with its allies and, for that matter, its adversaries. And Netanyahu, it's no secret, did not have a good relationship with Obama. He was very close to Trump and cultivated his ego in a way that was very clever politically. And we shouldn't forget that it's nothing new for Israeli prime ministers to have difficult with American presidents. We had Begin versus Reagan. We had all kinds of problems between Shamir and Bush. Almost every administration's had tensions at some point with the Israeli government. So that's going to happen at some point. I think Biden has an advantage in that he has a long-standing relationship with all the Israeli leaders, and in particular, Netanyahu. I don't think there's going to be any surprises between the two of them as to how they feel about the major issues. They are going to disagree on settlements, and they're going to disagree on Iran. And I think one of the big tests, from my point of view, is how public that is. If it can remain behind closed doors, the relationship, I think, will remain strong. If it is like in the Obama years, where they decide that they have to come out publicly condemning Israel at nearly every opportunity, that's going to create a much more tense relationship. But in the end, they have the same interest in keeping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And the Palestinians have no interest in negotiations or in any kind of a peace agreement. So the particular potential tension over that issue probably will not be as serious as it was during the Obama time.
Yeah, this notion of airing grievances between the two governments in public, I agree. It's better off done behind closed doors. I think the most conspicuous example of expressing those disagreements in public view happened at the UN Security Council in the Obama administration's final month in office, where they let pass UN resolution, Security Council resolution 2334, which was a very one-sided anti-Israel resolution. A bit more serious when it's passed by the Security Council as opposed to the General Assembly. And that it's regrettable that that resolution is still on the books. We referenced Iran. I want to probe a little bit deeper here, because we're really at a crossroads with respect to our Iran policy. The Obama administration negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, which President Trump abandoned in favor of increased pressure in the form of sanctions and the killing of Qasem Soleimani, who's commander of the Quds Force. Iran has since pressured the Biden administration by resuming uranium enrichment to 20% purity. 80% is weapons grade, I believe. But President Biden has so far refused to offer sanctions relief up front. Claudia, where do we go from here? I mean, we're likely headed toward a new round of negotiations, but what will that look like? And will it be broader and more exacting than the previous round was? Critics of the previous deal thought it was full of loopholes. Well, what do you anticipate here?
Well, obviously the UK is one of the members of the JCPOA, and we haven't seen much change in the UK's position. Obviously under Trump, they withdrew from the deal. The UK insisted that it was really important that we were still maintaining our position around the table. What's disappointed me is that every time there's been a breach of the agreement, the UK has responded to say, this is unacceptable and matters must escalate. But as a colleague of mine jokes, it's almost like copy and paste, because they don't then escalate it any further. It is the status quo is maintained. So I'm not confident, especially in the climate that we're in, that we're going to see a huge amount of change on this issue from the UK. There are obviously other domestic concerns. They have imprisoned a dual national, Nazanin Ratcliffe, and that has been brought to the House of Commons in multiple debates where they have been trying to release her. This is something which has caused a lot of Brits a great deal of anxiety and want to understand why the UK is not using its leverage. And so a lot of these issues seem to be tied up with one another. How can we maintain our leverage? How can we make sure that hostages or political prisoners are released? I don't anticipate that the UK's position is going to change drastically. What will be really interesting for me is to see how the US really tracks back from Trump without looking like it's really gone back on its word. So I suppose we'll wait and see on that front.
Mitchell, what do you think about that?
Well, the Obama policy was a complete disaster. And as I said, a number of the people who negotiated that are now back in the Biden administration advocating going back to it, clearly not admitting that they made any mistakes or that the agreement was never verifiable and was, as Claudia said, filled with loopholes from the beginning. And they don't seem to recognize that. Trump, I think, made the right decision in pulling out in his maximum pressure campaign, but ultimately he also failed. Basically, nothing changed in terms of minimizing Iran's nefarious activities, and of course now violating JCPOA. They've gotten closer to a nuclear bomb than they were before. The administration, I think, to its credit so far, has been much tougher than I think a lot of people feared in saying that we're not going to immediately give them any kind of sanctions relief, and that they have to take the first step to go back to compliance, although it was never really compliance. And so long as they keep to that position and they don't ease any of the sanctions, I think we're going to be in fairly strong position in dealing with the Iranians, because they're not going to be able to continue to function as their economy keeps deteriorating. But it's a lot of pressure on Biden from the progressive side, the pro-Iran side, to go back to the deal and to basically capitulate to them. I think it's clear that for this to be successful, they have to include Iran's sponsorship of terrorism, its ballistic missile program, and its destabilization of the region. And Biden and his people have talked about doing that. The Iranians, I think there's zero chance that they would ever sign any kind of agreement doing that. I think there's zero chance that they would ever give up their nuclear weapons capability. I think the Iranians are just like the North Koreans, that they believe having a nuke is their survival guarantee. And at the minimum, I think we have to insist that any agreement is a treaty that requires the Senate's confirmation, approval, and consent, which Obama refused to do because he would have lost. And I'm of the belief that the only way you're going to stop the Iranian nuclear program is through military action. I don't mean an invasion. There are all sorts of tactics that can be used. We already see both the United States and Israel employing cyber warfare, attacking shipping, doing a variety of things that I think can help stop the nukes from being built, short of an all-out war. But I don't think there's any kind of negotiation or sanctions that will stop the Iranians.
Do you think, do you see a willingness on the part of the Biden administration to use, like you said, we're not talking about all-out war, but to use the credible threat of military force as a tool in its arsenal, and to use it to in strategic instances to use force when necessary? What's your?
Well, that's really the key. The problem in the negotiations during the Obama administration was they had no credible threat. Yeah. Nobody believed that Obama was going to use military force against the Iranians, and the Iranians used that to their advantage and basically out-negotiated Obama, and he gave in on just about every major issue. We don't know exactly what Biden's going to do. Again, he's under a lot of pressure from his left to pull out of the region. When Obama pulled out troops from Iraq, that really sent the message to Iran that they were going to be safe from any military action. The fact that Biden so early in his administration did respond to the Iranian-backed attack on a U.S. base in Iraq was somewhat reassuring, but we'll have to see if he follows through. Trump talked a big game, but he also ultimately was unwilling to use force. He had threatened all kinds of draconian measures if Iran attacked a U.S. base, and then they attacked us with ballistic missiles, and he did nothing. So it's absolutely vital that we have a credible threat and show that we're not going to withdraw our troops from around their borders, and we are willing, if necessary, to defend our interests.
Yeah. I'd like to turn to some issues facing our respective communities at home. And Jeremy, you had a question you'd like to pose to Claudia on anti-Semitism in the UK?
Absolutely. Claudia, hi. I'm sure you'll agree with me that the last 4 to 5 years for the UK Jewish community has been, shall we say, extremely challenging. A very challenging political environment dealing with Labour and Corbyn anti-Semitism, the subsequent inquiry, and of course issues to do with university anti-Semitism as well. So a really difficult situation. But I was going to ask you the question, do you think that the Labour Party has adequately addressed its anti-Semitism problem in the wake of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership until a few months ago? Or is there a lot more work to be done?
Yeah, I mean, really interesting question and quite a lot to unpack. I think it's really important to say that there's probably never been a better time to be a Jew in Britain. And that might sound like an unusual thing to say, given everything that Jeremy has just said. But we are living in the golden era where we have, freedom of religion, equality before the law. And that's not to say that we aren't going to have instances like we've just had over the last few years. But what we've seen in Britain is that the electorate is a moderate electorate, and they did not vote in Jeremy Corbyn. So, and I think just to also further highlight that the kind of silver lining, if you like, from the Jeremy Corbyn era is that the community came together in a way that we haven't really come together for many, many decades, I would say. This is a community that has, doesn't like to go out to the street fighting, slightly reticent, but Jeremy Corbyn came along, and the threat of him becoming Prime Minister was enough to bring Jews out onto the streets and campaign against the opposition party, the Labour Party. This is something that was really unheard of. What we did at the JLC is we worked with other communal organisations to call that rally. We highlighted all the instances of anti-Semitism that we'd seen from Jeremy Corbyn and his allies over the years. And we also conducted a whole range of polls and focus groups. We polled the Jewish community and we polled the public because, we needed to understand what kind of language we can use to make people understand what anti-Semitism is. One of the things we found is that anti-Semitism is not a term that is really widely understood by the public. Anti-Jewish racism is something that seems to be something that people understand a bit more. So we tried to change our language. So even people who didn't really understand what anti-Semitism was, as they realised that it wasn't a good thing and that it was connected to other forms of extremism, which is, of course, something we tried to highlight about Jeremy Corbyn. This is not just about his attitude towards Jews. But for me, the key stat when we did our polling was that 87% of Jews saw Jeremy Corbyn as an anti-Semite. This was done in 2019 before the election, vis-a-vis 1% of people who thought Theresa May was an anti-Semite and 6% who thought Vince Cable, the Lib Dem leader, was an anti-Semite. So that's really puts into perspective the fear of the Jewish community at the time. And so when I say this is a good place for Jews and it's never been a better time for Jews to live in Britain, it's to say be proud and be assured, but always be vigilant, because even though we are living in a good time, we never know where that threat may come from, and it can come in the blink of an eye. But I am proud of the way that the Jewish community came together to really fight that. And with respect to the current Labour Party under new leadership with Sir Keir Starmer, I think they've shown tremendous desire to really put this right. What I can't say for sure is whether this is something that is being done for ideological reasons, because rightly many people will say, if it was done for ideological reasons, why did they not speak up louder when they were serving? Many of them were serving under Jeremy Corbyn when he was party leader. I take a different approach, and I think, when it comes to politics, work with people who you can work with. So they may not be doing it for ideological reasons, but they are doing it for electoral reasons. They realise that they actually can't win the next election until they deal with this issue, because the last election proved that people aren't going to vote in a party that has a problem with Jews. And so we are working as a community really closely with the current administration under Sir Keir Starmer, and we are making it known that we are still very hurt about what happened under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, and there's still a long way to go to change the culture and to really root out the anti-Semitic grassroots activists who did feel like when Jeremy Corbyn was leader that they had license to air these views, which they obviously held before. So there are lots of discussions, lots of work with the party, still a hell of a lot of work to be done, but I do think that we are in a better place, and I do have faith that they want to fix it and they're determined to. So all in all, not a bad result.
Yeah, I mean, your comments are making me think of a number of things, one of which is I think it underscores the importance of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism, because I think that part of the difficulty we've had in combating anti-Semitism over the past 2 decades, when it's been at its peak, is this the matter of making people understand what anti-Semitism is and all of its modern manifestations. A lot of people just don't know what all the different dimensions of this social problem, and I think we need to spread understanding in addition to other things. Mitchell, we only have 2 political parties here in the United States. Neither one of them has ever had a party leader along the lines of Jeremy Corbyn, but we have seen echoes nonetheless in American politics of the kind of bigotry or anti-Israel hatred that Jeremy Corbyn demonstrated. I mean, we've seen overt anti-Semitism from a few members of Congress, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, with some of their comments, I think, have shown their sympathies in this regard. Anti-Semitism exists on the far left, on the far right, from radical extremists. What do you make of the extent to which it has surfaced in American politics?
I think in American politics is probably the least problematic. By far the most problematic is on college campuses, where they refuse to even acknowledge that anti-Semitism can be defined, but we can talk about that more. In terms of politics, there was a poll that just came out this week that showed 58% of Americans sympathize with Israel. It's a continuation of the support that the American people have shown for decades now. In fact, it's been going up generally every decade. The problem has been with liberals and Democrats, who have been much less sympathetic, but even they haven't changed dramatically. If you go to the Jewish Virtual Library, you look at a lot of the statistics I have there, and a lot of people have this misperception that the Democrats were once super pro-Israel and now aren't pro-Israel anymore. In fact, they are about the same as they were in the 1970s. About 45% of Democrats support Israel. The big change has been that Republicans have dramatically increased their support, from similar to the Democrats in the 70s, around 45% or so. Now they're at 80%. As you said, in terms of Congress, we have a few members, and that's the key, very few. You have basically 4 or 5 members of Congress who are outspokenly anti-Israel and borderline, if not overtly anti-Semitic. And the rest of Congress is extremely supportive of Israel. We see it in terms of the recent vote on foreign aid that gave Israel, again, it's more than $3 billion in military assistance. We see it in the support for the various joint military programs. But we have some vocal people on both right and left. We had Bernie Sanders during the campaign, who was no Jeremy Corbyn, but he was certainly someone who was troubling to a lot of us, given his views on Israel. But he didn't win. And if you look at the Democratic platform, this also was very pro-Israel, where you had some of the Bernie Sanders people who were trying to make it much less sympathetic to Israel. They failed. So I think on the political level, we do have extremists on both poles, but the vast majority of Americans and the vast majority of members of Congress, and I think this administration, remain very, very sympathetic to Israel, see it as a country that shares our values and interests, and that this is going to ensure that, at least for the near future, U.S.-Israel relations are going to be really strong. And the other thing I think to point out is probably other than Great Britain, the United States has more in-depth ties with Israel than any other country, because it's not just at the federal level in Congress, it's at the state level, it's at the local level. I'm just in the process in the Jewish Virtual Library of updating the data I have on each of the 50 states and their relationships with Israel. They have a huge amount of trade between each of these states. They're getting grants from binational foundations to do joint research. You know, you see mayors going back and forth. You see law enforcement going back and forth. You have more than 10,000 U.S. companies that do business in Israel or have bases in Israel. So it's the breadth and depth of the relationship between Israelis and Americans that go way beyond the politics that really are the key to the strength of the relationship.
Yeah, in fact, this has been one of the main battlegrounds of the BDS movement in recent years at state legislatures. I should say not just the BDS movement, but the movement to combat BDS. A number of state legislatures have taken up measures to prohibit the state investment in companies that ban Israel. So that's where that issue is playing out.
Well, BDS has been a total failure overall, and it's been especially a failure in the United States. And in fact, what you're talking about is a good indication of the backlash. In fact, just this week, or maybe it was last week, Utah became the 33rd state to have some sort of legislation or resolution against a boycott. We think that Idaho may be next. So yeah, you have the states reacting, you have Congress reacting against it. There's really virtually no support for BDS outside handfuls of students on a handful of campuses around the country, and that has no impact whatsoever on Israel. It certainly has no impact whatsoever on Israeli policy. But you know, it's something that riles up the Jewish community. It's something I'm very involved in working against to try to help Jewish students, especially on campuses, who feel very threatened and under siege by these anti-Israel groups who promote BDS. But you know, tangibly, it's had zero impact on U.S. policy.
Yeah, well, let me, I'd like to touch on something else that has riled up people at the grassroots level. We've seen this past year has been one of racial strife in both the US and the UK. And let's be clear, all Jews share their desire for racial justice and racial equality. But it seems like the role of academic movements like critical race theory and intersectionality, the role that they played in this struggle for racial equality has been very problematic for Jews in Israel, as we've seen in the recent controversy over the ethnic studies curriculum in California high schools, to the extent that Jews are depicted as part of the dominant privileged class and Israel as a white colonial occupier, while Palestinians are seen as a proxy for oppressed minorities at home. Jews will suffer from this skewed portrayal. And this narrative, I think, has provided some of the momentum behind the BDS movement, and biased media coverage. That's another aspect of all this, among other things. I'd like to hear from both of you. Are you optimistic about being able to set the narrative straight on these issues?
Well, let me say, as you can see, I'm kind of an old guy. So I've seen this before. There's this notion that this is all somehow new. The language has changed, but most of this we saw as far back as the 60s and the 70s, that there was an effort for the anti-Israel groups to join with the militant Black groups, for example, in the 60s, that they were joining with a whole variety of anti-war groups. It's not that new. They came up with a new name for it, intersectionality, but they were doing it for decades. And so I guess I'm less worried than a lot of people, because I think we've seen it before, and it's nothing new. And we have been able to deal with it. We see that, again, it hasn't affected U.S. policy over the years, and I don't think it will in the future, given how marginal basically it is. I think it's unfortunate, because Jews are champions of civil and human rights, and students are suffering because they are now being ostracized from organizations that they would naturally be leaders of in dealing with human rights and social justice issues, where you have them being told basically, because you're a Jew, because you're a Zionist, because you support Israel, you are not welcome here. Again, I could show you reports that the American Jewish Committee did 30 years ago, where this same thing was going on. So I think it's disturbing that there are still people who make these kinds of unjustified comparisons between the treatment of Palestinians and the treatment of other people who may be suffering persecution from one way or the other. It's partly a problem of American Jewish students also being poorly educated, that they don't know the difference when they hear their colleagues or their peers talking about Israel being like South Africa, or that they are colonialists. They don't know enough of the alphabet of Jewish and Israeli history to be able to respond to it and to recognize that these things aren't wrong. This is why I publish a book called Myths and Facts, which again is in Jewish Virtual Library, that tries to give them the ammunition and the facts they need to rebut these things. But it's very difficult, especially when it's coming from professors in your classroom who have the power over you and are very intimidating. And they have this view that their classroom can be used for basically putting out their own political views. And that has, I think, poisoned a lot of the university dialogue.
Claudia and Jeremy, I'd like to hear from both of you about the UK context on this, because you're both Jewish professionals and you both are need to react from time to time about biased media coverage against Israel or anti-Israel boycott movements and so forth. So you really see the way that these kind of social issues play out with respect to Jews in Israel. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Claudia, how about you first?
Yeah, well, I think Mitchell is right in that this is definitely not a new issue. The postmodernism that we've seen on campus is something which has been around for a very long time. the issue of identity politics in general, I think, has always been more polarized in the US, particularly on race for obvious issues. But we're definitely seeing that debate and that narrative coming over much more to the UK. And there have been recent flashpoints. The killing of George Floyd, I think, is something which was felt globally, whether it was felt more keenly because of the global pandemic or because that's probably the time that people saw everything happening online and there was a kind of feeling that this was a global issue and that we should all put our head above the parapet. I think also to go back to something Mitchell said is that to me there's a difference between social justice as a cause and social justice as a movement. Social justice as a cause is something which all Jews will recognize is our cause. Without social justice, Jews don't have the freedoms that I spoke about earlier on this evening. They don't have those. They don't have those freedoms. But the social justice as a movement, to me, the challenge is that there is this hierarchy where there's a hierarchy of oppression, and you can fit onto certain parts of that ladder depending on various aspects of your identity, the color of your skin, your sexuality, your gender, your socioeconomic status. And so because Jews, to use the kind of phrase punching up racism, Jews are seen as being very high on that ladder, seen as white, when of course not all Jews are seen as privileged and rich, when of course not all Jews are privileged and rich. It feels very, very difficult to empathize with any suffering that Jews may have. And this reminds me of a very key quote from a British author called Gabriel Hogrund. He did a book into the Corbyn years, and he interviewed an ally of Jeremy Corbyn, Andrew Murray, and said, explain to me, Jeremy Corbyn seems to be an ally in the fight against racism. And he constantly is quoted as saying he hasn't got a racist bone in his body. Why is it he's never understood the suffering of the Jews? And his response was really instructive. He said, well, the reason that he can't understand the suffering of Jews is because they are seen as privileged. He finds it hard to empathize. And that said it all. You know, we are in living memory of the Holocaust. We are in living memory of one of the biggest genocides. And Jeremy Corbyn and people who are belonging to the social justice movement can't recognize that Jews can be victims. Another book I want to give a plug to is a new book, which I've just ordered. David Baddiel, who's a comedian and a commentator here, has just written a book called Jews Don't Count. What he sees in the progressive circles about Jews not being given the same sympathies that other minorities face when they are victims of racism or prejudice. And again, he goes back to this narrative of when you're looking at the hierarchy, Jews somehow sit at the top, and therefore it's fine to dismiss, or in some cases to say, actually, the discrimination they face is all part of the greater good. So I don't feel hugely optimistic that that's something that can change. What I think is really important is for Jews to continue fighting social justice as a cause, but fighting back against the movement which says that our rights and our prejudice is something that we can't take ownership for. And that's not to say that Jews should be victims. Jews should be proud, but they should also fight for the acknowledgement of wrongs done against them.
Yeah. We have a few minutes left, and I think we'd be remiss since we're talking about Jewish concerns here, if we didn't talk about this viral pandemic that we're starting to see a light at the end of the tunnel on. Before the program began, the several of us were talking about what stage we're on in receiving our vaccines, and so this gives all of us hope. But can each of you talk about how the communities in the two respective countries have been impacted by the virus? I mean, as individuals, we're impacted in the same way the rest of the population is, but what has it meant for Jewish institutions, not just in terms of their survival and success, but also in terms of the way we imagine the role of Jewish institutions in our lives. I mean, if nothing else, we've all become intimately more, vastly more familiar with video programming, video meetings, and conversations and so forth, like we're doing right now, and that's something that's likely to have a lasting impact. So I'm curious to hear from each of you. Jeremy, did you have something also that you wanted to add? I'm sorry, I think I may have skipped over.
No, that's fine. I mean, I'll sort of answer your question as best as I can. I mean, certainly, in one sense, the British Jewish community has been deeply impacted by COVID. I think the latest figure suggests 900 have died. The community here is about 270 to 280,000. So it's about 0.3 to 0.4% of the population. What's interesting, in fact, picking up on a point that Claudia made, is about how in modern identity politics, Jews are not, they don't count. They should count, but they don't. And when you come to compiling statistics of how ethnic minorities have fared, there has been a disproportionate impact, certainly on Black Britons, on other ethnic minorities. But if you consider Jews, as you should do, as an ethno-religious minority, then Jews should be added on to those statistics. And I think what you'll find is that actually Jews have suffered disproportionately worse than any other minority in Britain. So that's an interesting anomaly. And you pick up on the point that obviously there's been a major impact on Jewish institutions. I mean, Claudia can talk about that side of things as well. But speaking for B'nai B'rith, there's no doubt that we've completely converted from all our normal face-to-face contacts with embassies and with high commissions, and instead we have reached out to our membership purely online. We've engaged in all kinds of virtual meetings, and I think that's exactly what synagogues and other institutions have been forced to do. And I think in some respects successfully, that they have been able to keep in touch with all their members and try to create a semblance of meaningful communal life. You can never properly replace that feeling of genuine physical togetherness. But I think they have been able to do the very best that they can, with the resources available, to try and create a semblance of communal life and to keep in touch with people. But of course, I think the sense of probably most British Jews is that they are aching to get back to a sense of normality, which will obviously include communal normality and being able to have more meaningful get-togethers.
I'll just come in. Yeah, I'll just come in just since we're talking about the impact on British Jews. Jeremy's right, the Jewish community have been disproportionately affected. It's unclear whether that's to do with Jews because we're an ethnicity or because we are actually slightly older on average as a community. And it obviously does impact older people more seriously. With respect to the changes from Corona, obviously as a community, not just here in the UK, globally, we're centered around gathering, whether it's school or life cycle events. And so it has been a huge challenge in adapting to that. I think the difference perhaps in the UK vis-a-vis the US is that we have more Orthodox people in the UK, rather the percentage of Jews in the UK are more Orthodox. And so having synagogue services online on Shabbat, on Yom Tov is much harder, and we've had to find lots of loopholes as how to do these things. With respect to the working environment, I'm really keen that we don't lose some of the benefits that we have found from working online, being able to gather at a moment's notice, being able to be much more flexible, being able to have a better work-life balance. So I really think that it's important, as with the Jeremy and silver lining, we take these crises and we find the silver lining. And to me, that silver lining is that many more people have been able to do their job remotely and probably more efficiently. So as an umbrella body organisation, the majority of our members are charities, and they have been severely impacted because what they have found is that they have a greater demand for their services because they are dealing, in many cases, with vulnerable beneficiaries, old age homes and vulnerable children, etc. But they have had a decrease in their funding. That was our prediction at the start. But what happened is there's been lots of innovation in the community with respect to fundraising, crowdfunding campaigns, something that we wanted to explore before the pandemic. And the pandemic has been a catalyst for us to do lots of really interesting things that perhaps we should have done before, but this gave us the nudge to do it. And actually, many of our charities have continued to do really well on the fundraising front. So that's something that we hadn't anticipated, but we're really pleased to see. So I think there'll be a lot of change post-pandemic and lots of good things that we can take away.
Mitchell, Jewish communal life in here in the United States in a COVID and post-COVID environment.
But a couple of things. I think a lot of the things are similar to what Claudia was saying, Jeremy. I think one thing that's similar to what has happened at a greater extent in Israel has been some hostility toward the ultra-Orthodox. It's mostly centered in New York because that's where most of the events have taken place, where you've had these mass gatherings that have upset some people who see that as disrespecting the guidelines that are supposed to be protecting us. And so there's been a little tension that spread a little beyond New York, but it seems mostly centered in New York. I think there's people who are outside it, just as they see it going on in Israel, have a certain, if they're not Orthodox, it colors their view, let's say, of Orthodox behavior. I think on sort of the positive side is the ability now and recognition that we can reach far greater audiences than we ever thought before, when we were having our little meetings at our synagogues or communities where we'd be lucky if we get 50, 100 people. You know, now we can get hundreds, thousands online through these Zoom events, through Facebook and other things. I know my Jewish virtual library has become much more needed as students have been stuck in their homes and having to rely more on the internet for their information. Fortunately, they can get credible information from us. But I think that that's one of the most beneficial things, is the fact that now we see that we can really reach a much wider audience at any one time than we ever thought we could when we were relying on things face to face. But we're going to have to adjust as we see how the pandemic pans out, whether it really does go away and we can return to normal in the next 6 to 12 months, or if it's going to persist in some way and force us to continue to live in new ways. I think in terms of things like institutional fundraising, it's definitely been difficult. A lot of organizations I know rely on galas, for example. I talked to one leader who said, their gala basically raised nothing, practically, because who's going to give money to buy a table, through the Zoom? Some have done better than others, but I think that's hurt a lot of the organizations. To their credit, some of the big foundations have come together to try to bail out, in a way, some of the organizations that have had trouble, and also to contribute to a lot of the social welfare groups. But it's going to be an ongoing challenge, I think, to adjust to what's going to be a new reality. It's not going to go back to the way it used to be.
Well, we're just about at the end of our allotted time, but I just wanted to give each of you an opportunity before we close out. Are there any issues that we haven't covered that are worth a look ahead to, as something that we should, something that's on the horizon that we need to keep an eye out for, or any closing observations that you have about the issues that we've discussed already?
Let me just say, in general, that we need to do war games, for lack of a better term. The Pentagon sits around all day. They have people figuring out what happens if we go to war with China. What happens if China attacks Taiwan? What happens if North Korea, launches nuclear weapons? And most of those things, sit in a drawer. They never get used. But the Jewish community too often simply is in a reactive mode. We wait until something happens, and then we are forced to defend ourselves or be more reactive. And I think what the community needs to do is to think more with more foresight, say, what are the 10 issues that may come up in the future? U.S.-Israel relations, UK-Israel relations, and Jewish communal relations. What happens if Iran attacks Israel? What happens if Israel goes back into Gaza? I mean, there are a whole variety of things that will have implications for how the community deals with itself, with the government, and with our peers. So I think that's something that we have to focus a lot more on than we ever have.
Good strategic insight there. Claudia, your closing thoughts?
I mean, I agree with Mitchell. It's really important to be, not to be reactive, but to think long term. And so actually as an organisation, that's something the JLC attempts to do. It attempts to bring together the mainstream communal organisations and think, what are the issues that are going to affect all of us? And so, one example, not only foreign policy issue, a domestic example is, how are we going to get our charities to bring themselves into the 21st century? How are we going to use digital innovations, of which, we've already started using quite a few, but what else can we do to make sure that our organizations are saving money, our organizations are working in the best and the most efficient way possible, using things that we know can make our services so much stronger? How can we do that? And I think, on the political front, it's really important to, as Mitchell says, think ahead. During the Jeremy Corbyn years, we organised sessions where we could think about what would it mean if Jeremy Corbyn was Prime Minister? Where would we have to focus immediately? Because the impact on the community would not just be about the anti-Semitism and his lack of support for Israel. It would be very much domestic. Would he pull security funding from schools? Really thinking about these things. And, it is important to kind of look ahead and think what will be the things that we need to react to, and not to wait till that moment.
Indeed. Jeremy, anything you'd like to add before we close out?
Well, I mean, we face so many different challenges, but I mean, for me, there is one thing that really does stick out from so many conversations with people in Britain, and even in some cases with Jewish students, and that's that there is so much ignorance of basic issues to do with Jews and Judaism. And I think we tend to live, I think, in a bubble where we assume that our concerns are ones that other people will somehow automatically share, and too many people outside of our own community certainly just don't know that much about Israel. They don't know much about the conflict. They don't know much about anti-Semitism. They don't know much about Judaism. And so I think our role is to be advocates. It is to educate, and it is to inform. And that's a great deal, for example, of what B'nai B'rith does. But I think that extends also to Jewish students. And we've talked about Jewish students going on often very hostile university campuses where they're faced by radical sections of the student body that are determined to foist a lot of anti-Israel and sometimes anti-Semitic agendas. And I think that Jewish students have to be informed. They have to be empowered through knowledge, and that will enable them to better survive what can be very, very challenging environments. So I think that's part of what I know the JLC does. It's part of what Mitchell is doing, and it's part of what B'nai B'rith is doing as well, both in Washington and London.
Excellent. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Mitchell Bard and Claudia Mendoza, for a very enlightening discussion today. I know I've learned, I think all of us have. Thanks also to my colleague, Jeremy Havardi in London, and our digital media guru, Alex King, for bringing this program to everyone's screens at home. Thanks also to our viewers in the US and the UK and around the world. A recording of this program will shortly be available on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Please stay tuned for future B'nai B'rith programs. And of course, you can go to bnaibrith.org at any time for more information about the organization's activities. Take care and stay safe.